Hey everybody, my name is Daniel Marino and this is Karate Thoughts. So I'm a lifelong karate practitioner. I've also been a karate teacher for my entire adult life. And this is just a weekly series where I take questions in the comment section and answer them. So I got some pretty good questions last week. Let's get to it. First one is from a user named Michael T83310. And he said, would love to hear your thoughts on the arts of Hapkido and Aikido, whether or not you think they provide any value for actual fighting or if they're just pure theory and don't work in fighting. So this is a pretty good question. I'm excited to get into it. I think at the heart of it is some issues that are very important for all traditional martial arts people to consider. I'm not super familiar with Aikido or Hapkido. My impression of Hapkido is kind of just like Korean Aikido with more kicks. But I'm going to speak kind of more specifically to Aikido. And my impression is that Aikido is a martial art where it's very common for there to be almost no sparring in your practice. I'm sure that this isn't true of everyone in the Aikido world. Like all martial arts, I'm sure it's practiced different ways by different people, but it does seem to be that the common training methodology found in Aikido simply just does not include any kind of sparring. In my opinion, sparring and competition are what make a martial art functional. Right? You have to be applying what you do against intelligent resistance for you to develop something that really works and is going to serve you, when you need it. So this is not an issue that is unique to Aikido. It's found a lot in all traditional martial arts, in my opinion. But I think it does seem to be an issue that is particularly present in Aikido. So, to take this from the karate perspective, when I was growing up learning karate, I learned some takedowns, and also a lot of different wrist locks and stuff like that. I actually think that those wrist locks that were included in the curriculum that I learned were derived from Aikido specifically. But these techniques were never included in our sparring practice, right? They were done in the compliant drills that were a part of testing for us. So you would practice these things with a compliant partner that was just letting you apply it to prepare it so that you could perform it on the testing floor to get your next rank. That was the place that it served in our curriculum. And because it never transferred to sparring, I never developed any kind of functional ability with any of those techniques. So that's why I say this is not something that's unique to Aikido. It might be this problem might be particularly present in Aikido, but it's certainly there in karate as well. Even martial arts that do spar, we often only spar with some of the techniques that are included in our overall art. Karate specifically is like it's just kicks and punches. I grew up sparring all the time. But that sparring was very directly related to the point fighting competitions that I and the other students in the school were participating in. We didn't include takedowns, we didn't include joint locks, we didn't include any of that stuff in the sparring. That was stuff that we did as just almost an entirely separate practice. A large part of the content that I share on this channel is the clinch sparring that I have incorporated into my training and into my teaching. And the reason why I've incorporated that stuff is because it enables us to spar with the techniques that are found in our traditional forms and also that are done in our compliant drills. So it makes it so that it gives us the ability to develop those techniques so that we can actually use them, just like we've always done, with the longer range striking techniques that are more common in karate. So that's what I would say about it. There's some loaded questions here with, is Aikido useless? I'm not going to say, it's not that I think that there's nothing of value to be found in Aikido or Hapkido. I'm sure that there is. I'm sure there's a lot of good technical content to be found there. But the reason why those martial arts don't have the best reputation, I would say, is because the sparring is often missing from the methodology, right? That's It's just the number one issue. If you aren't sparring with what you do, you're not going to develop it to the ability that you can actually use it against someone who isn't being compliant. So I do think this creates other issues as well. It's like, because when you're not sparring with the techniques, we don't really have an idea of how effective they are. So then it tends to be that you have a lot of these fancy wrist locks and takedowns that maybe look really cool from the outside, and I think the art tends to gravitate towards that stuff because you're not using it, so we're not gonna, what's the way to put this? So, if you take people who are already competent grapplers, they've already developed like a baseline of grappling ability, and you show them some fancy Aikido wrist lock type technique, I think often they'll be able to make it work, right? Because they already have those foundational skills. They already know how to grapple. The problem that you get with traditional martial arts is you get like the end point, that finished product, the fancy wrist lock, but you don't have any of the fundamentals that actually give you a chance of pulling it off. I would say that it's also worth considering that a lot of the techniques found in Aikido, and a lot of them also, I would say, in common in karate curriculums, the Tung Sudo curriculum that we do a lot of those wrist lock and other standing joint lock techniques. I mean, you don't really see a lot of those in live grappling competitions or in a competition like MMA. So I do get the impression that a lot of that stuff, although it may have a role to serve, it's probably going to have a pretty small place in your overall approach to fighting and self-defense, if you're training in a functional way. But I don't think it should be written off. I certainly think there's value to it. So that's my thoughts on the issue, is that at the end of the day, if Aikido and Hapkido, if it's a training methodology that includes sparring as a fundamental part of the way you develop your ability so you can use it against resistance, then yeah, I'm sure it's it's a good place to train and a good way to practice. If you don't have that, then yeah, you're not going to develop something. I mean, you might get other benefits from it. It might be good exercise still, it might be just something cool that you enjoy, but you're not going to develop functional ability for fighting or self-defense. So let's move along. Next one was from a user named Donkey E Makes You Wiser Now. And he said, what would you say is the relationship between Taekyon and Tung Sudo in the creation of Taekwondo? Okay, so Taekyon is a indigenous Korean martial art that has been recreated by modern practitioners. That's my impression of it. Its relation, when Korea was occupied by the Japanese, a lot of their traditional culture was suppressed, and I think that's the story that you hear a lot about it, that these martial arts like Taekyon and Subak were a part of Korean culture in the past, but they were not, there's not a direct line of practitioners up until the modern day. I believe that there was a single guy who claims to have practiced Taekyon, in secret, and to have been a large part of, he's largely responsible for the modern revival that you have with Taekyon. Again, I'm not an expert about this. I'm sure there are other people that could speak to it better than I can. If somebody wants to correct me in the comments, please feel free. But I don't know how much connection there is to like modern Taekyon and whatever the art was actually like in the past. I'm not sure that we really know what it was like in the past. You do also have accounts from early Korean karate practitioners. Hwang Ki, who I derive my lineage from, claims to have witnessed a Taekyon practitioner defend himself against multiple attackers, and that was a part of, I guess, what inspired him to become a martial artist. I think that there are a lot of other figures in Korean martial arts with similar stories where they don't claim to have trained in Taekyon, but they claim to have witnessed it and seen it. So there might be something to that. There definitely is something about the Korean style of kicking that I think is unique and different from other places in the karate world. Whether or not the Korean kicking was kind of a modern innovation, in the early 1900s by the Koreans of the time, or whether it's something that comes from the past, that comes from older arts like Taekyon. I don't know. I don't know if anybody can answer that definitively. But my guess would be maybe it's something of a mix between the two. But anyway, so to say the relationship between Taekyon and Tang Sudo, I would say is loose at best. And then, how they relate to the creation of Taekwondo. I mean, Taekwondo is just a movement, sponsored by the Korean government to unify the Korean martial arts and create a national sport. That's what Taekwondo is today. It's the national sport of Korea. That's the relationship between Taekwondo and Tang Sudo. Is that Tang Sudo is kind of just an older name for the art. If it just means, Tang Sudo means karate. Karate-do would be Japanese pronunciation. Tang Sudo would be Korean pronunciation. So prior to the invention of the term Taekwondo, Tang Sudo was just a very common name of what was being practiced in Korea. It's still the name of my style of what I do today, because my lineage comes from one of the schools in Korea that didn't join the unification movement of Taekwondo. But yeah, that's what I would say about it, is that Taekwondo is just kind of the modern art. It is very closely related to Tang Sudo. And then Taekyon is an older Korean martial art that might have had some indirect influence on both Tang Sudo and Taekwondo. That's what I would say about it. So lastly, we have a question from Anthony Russomano 7015. And he just kind of left a long comment, but there was a question included in it. He was talking a lot about just the benefits of cross-training. And he said, why the politics? Why don't we share the knowledge amongst each other more? So, I think many people have this experience, and especially in traditional martial arts, where it's kind of, especially in the past, I don't think it's as true today, where cross-training was kind of looked down upon, and it was expected that you wouldn't be going around and training with different people and trying to learn from different people, but that you would be loyal to your teacher or your school or your organization and train only there. If you're asking why this is the case, I mean, there's something to be said that when you're a teacher, that you don't want your students, especially if they're novices and they're beginners, you don't want them going off and doing other things and being distracted. You want them to be focused on learning and excelling at what you do. I don't think that's necessarily bad. I do think that when people get to the point that they're more long-term practitioners, I think there's a lot of advantages to getting out there and trying something new. It was something I personally experienced. I'd say that I practiced Tang Sudo exclusively, from the time I was about 9 years old until I was in my early 20s when I tested for my 4th Dan. And I was very involved in competition, but I had a shoulder injury that took me out of the competition. So then I started to get more into like bunkai. So I went to a lot of seminars where I learned from different people that had expertise in interpreting the traditional forms. So I would consider that almost like I was getting into a different area of karate, almost like a different style of karate. And I think I benefited from it immensely. I think that it's not that there isn't value, to where we come from and what we do, but when you spend, and this is a little bit different maybe for beginners and less experienced practitioners, but when you spend a decade, practicing something like intensively, and you get to the point that you're pretty good at it, you can always be better, but there is like a point of diminishing returns. Like, okay, you've gotten to the point where you've learned this art, and you've developed a good ability in it, and you can continue to improve, of course, but I think your progress slows down a lot as you go. Stepping out of it and learning something totally new, I think, is a really good way to expand your ability and your knowledge on something. And I think people should do it. I think they should be encouraged to do it. The reason, people being discouraged from this in the past, I think it's just human nature, you know. Maybe sometimes people feel a little bit threatened by learning things that, or maybe their students or people that they know, their training partners, learning things that they don't know how to do. Maybe they don't want to spend the time to learn how to do it. You know, I think it's just stuff like that. But I think that the martial arts world really has improved in this aspect and is getting better as time goes on. I think cross-training is just more and more common and accepted. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or topics for next week, please leave them in the comments below.